Charlie, thank you so much for joining us on the Algarve video podcast.
Very
Really
well.
cool of you to come over. And it's nice to do this in real life. Often we do it online, so it's a bit weird, but it's nice to have this kind of interaction.
Well, we do this all the time anyway. We never actually film it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's good to have
It's
you.
quite nice to get it captured in the can.
But now today, let's talk a little bit about, because Charlie is originally British, right? You were born around London, around that area, right?
I was, yeah.
And then you decided to move to Portugal. Why on earth would you want to move to Portugal?
Well, I suppose it goes back to my childhood when, and I'm going to have to relay this through stories that have been relayed from parents, but my great aunt moved out here in the mid-1960s. She retired from, or her and her husband retired up from the Congo, and they came and bought a place in Praia de Luz. So this would have been about...
Other side of Lagos, right?
Exactly, about 1965, 1966, sometime around that. And then I think that triggered my grandparents to come out and visit them. And then shortly after that visit, my grandfather then bought a house here in about 67, 68. And that was on one of the very original houses that were being built in Valdelobo.
Okay, back in Lille, yeah.
Back in Lille. And Valdelobo at that point was just a hotel. The golf course had just been laid out. And, you know, the beginnings of, you know, the villas being built around it. But it was completely different from how it was now. Because a huge amount of constructions happened there and planting and trees and everything. So that then triggered my parents coming out to visit my grandparents. And then the next thing I remember was I was brought out at 6 months old, 1970. Gives away my age a little bit.
Well, we're exactly the same age.
There you go. And then from that point onwards, the family had just been coming out year after year after year to visit, grandparents.
So Portugal's always been a part of the family, and you've known it extremely well, right?
Yeah,
Especially
I mean, but I always knew it from a holiday perspective,
Hmm.
and visiting Portugal from a holiday perspective is very different from living here. And so for the first sort of 20 years of my life, you know, I was coming out every summer holidays and Easters and visiting, you know, grandparents and, you know, great aunts and things. And then, I got up to about the age of 20 and I sort of thought, there's got to be more to life than just Portugal. Because Portugal was kind of all I really knew from a perspective of summer holidays. So I didn't actually come back here again until I was in my early 30s.
So you ventured around the rest of the world?
Yeah. Work had taken me away and the world opened up and, you know, got to see a whole range of places through, you know, just different experiences. And then when my daughter was born, I then repeated effectively what my parents had done with my sister and I, which was we came back somewhere that was very familiar, very safe. Daughter learnt to swim in the ocean off Temperance Beach and the swimming pools around the sort of, you know, that sort of area. And the pattern sort of repeated itself.
So when did you decide, well, this might be a nice place to live?
So it
your
was.
parents were living here full time, right?
Yeah, no, not full time, but they were spending a lot of time down here, and I'd resisted it because most children don't follow their parents' footsteps or try not to. You think it's sort of not cool.
No.
But as you get older, and so Joe and I were living up in London, and the kids, of which there are 3, had sort of got to an age where they were flying the nest and doing their own thing. One's down in Cape Town, one's in Oslo, one's still in London. And it was like, well, where do we situate ourselves? And, I've been in London for the best part of sort of 20, 25 years. And I'd always thought about living overseas, but my wife's South African. And it was the familiarity she felt. Yeah. It was the familiarity she felt of the link that Portugal seemed to have with South Africa. And it's the food influences that have come up from places like Angola and Mozambique, and the flora and the fauna, which is very reminiscent, as you all know, from parts of the Cape. And there's also that little wildness about it. It's not as pristine in the sense of over manicured as other countries in Europe. And Joe felt very comfortable here. I obviously knew it from a perspective of having sort of grown up through my holidays here.
But it's an interesting point that you make, because it isn't all super manicured, and it's like a little bit crusty here and there. And I remember going on holiday when I first arrived, going to holiday in Italy.
Yes.
And everything was just, it was Bologna, it was Firenze, and all that. And then you come back here and it's just, the dusty old Algarve.
Absolutely.
It was nice, and it just feels real to live.
It's raw,
exactly.
and it gets raw very quickly, because you come up from that coastline and you come 3 or 4 kilometres inland, and I mean it totally changes. So we decided this was what I call a soft stepping stone. So it was an easy move for us to make. I was very familiar with it, but I was not familiar with living here, which is a completely different thing from visiting. So we had to go through that whole process of learning to move here and live here, and the differences and the challenges that takes.
But also, like, a consideration is professional consideration, because obviously you don't have any corporate jobs, and I know you were pretty involved in the golf tours and things like that.
Well, yeah, back in a previous life, obviously, I was doing a proper job back then, as they say. I was in the sort of corporate sports sponsorship world, back in the UK. That all sort of changed, 15, 16 years ago, and through what I now do, I'm able to do it from wherever I wanted to in the world. So moving here wasn't.
What is that, by the way?
Well, I run an expedition company called Drift, and my skill set changed from sort of managing sports events, and then effectively now managing expeditions. So
essentially, those expeditions are going all around the world. So whether you change the base from London to Algarve,
exactly. My operational base in terms of where I do the work is always overseas. So where my home base is to a degree irrelevant, especially with modern technology and communications and things. So now I had a very good client base and corporate base. That the fact that I was now based here was to a degree irrelevant. And we bought in 2019, which was just sort of prior COVID. So of course then the world locked down anyway. So it didn't really matter where one was. Everybody was isolated. The fact that I was in Portugal was neither here nor there. So
but the relocation, I mean, you moved, obviously before you bought, you moved over here beforehand. Did you come before or after Brexit?
Came before. Joe and I we sort of made the decision, which was, where do we want to be? What's the next evolution of our life? We were in our 50s, or just approaching them, and it was okay. What do we want to get out of life? Because life's quite short and precious, and I'd seen this sort of treadmill going on with friends and people in London or any other city, where they're kind of stuck in this hamster wheel of trying to sort of locked into mortgages, locked into jobs, and keeping the jobs to pay the mortgages, and then eventually they hope they'll get to a point where they can retire at 60, 65, whatever the age is, and some of them manage to do it earlier, some of them don't manage to do it, and you feel like you're existing rather than living. And part of the reason to come down here was to actually just live and enjoy a very different quality of life, or a different style of life. And of course, at the time, being able to sort of capitalise on property and assets in London and transfer them here, your pound, you're winning in that sense. So we're able to come down here and not repeat the pattern of having to take mortgages out and have other people or other entities control your financial destiny. So to a degree, you can clear all your mortgages and any debts, and you have an element of securities. You just need whatever you need to live, which is a great appeal of being in this part of the world.
Perfect. Okay, so when you relocated, it was super easy for you because you didn't have to visa or anything like that. The hassle now, you have to get a D7 visa, a D8 visa if you're coming from the UK. But now you've obviously spoken to a lot of other people, and the initial move must have been quite different. But I mean, you knew this area pretty well, so was it seamless?
I knew the area, so I knew the geography.
Yeah.
But what I had to learn, and whether I've done it rightly or wrongly, is I had to learn the steps that you need to, the process of turning from a tourist into effectively a resident. And yeah, I've learned from trial and error. So the first process was I think I got my NIF number. That was the first thing. Fairly simple. I went off to the finances office.
Said, "Hi, I'm Charlie.
Hi,
Give me
I'm
my
Charlie." And I didn't own anything at that point. And
No.
this was I think 15 years ago. I think I got a NIF number, and it was partly because we had a collective interest on my parents' home, so we all had a NIF number for that.
number.
So that was straightforward, and that was a no-brainer. And then the next step, obviously, having moved down here in 2019, Brexit, the result had come, but that hadn't even been a consideration. We didn't move down here as a result of Brexit. It just happened to happen while we were moving down. But we were here just before that kind of got triggered. So we applied for residency. And I'd heard all these stories about, oh, it's a nightmare and you've got to go and employ somebody to do this. And I was thinking, well, how difficult can it be? So I sort of Googled the process. I went to the camera in Lule and they told me where to go. And Joe and I went off with our paperwork and our documents and we applied. And the next thing, very efficiently, we had our sort of, yes, come on in, just check this, stamp that, and bang.
You're a temporary resident.
You're a temporary resident.
Yeah.
What I then didn't follow up on, or people don't follow up on, is, or certainly from my experience, there wasn't then now that you are a temporary resident, here is what you have to do. So there's no sort of magic bit of paper that they give you, which says, okay, here are your obligations now as a temporary resident. You have to do, the following.
Get in with the health people.
It's everything from the health people to driving licenses to finance portals to the rules and regulations that you have to abide by in order to comply as a resident. So there's no magic one piece of paper. And you just learn that as you go along. I think one of the biggest challenges we had was actually just getting post boxes. I mean, that might sound really strange, but when we moved into our place, which was a sort of a ruin that we'd renovated, there was no address because so many of the roads actually don't have names. There were a whole bunch of post boxes up at the top of the road, of which we didn't have one allocated. So for months, I mean, literally months, I was trying to find out how to get a post box, which I thought was going to be a very simple thing. I went down to the CTT office and they sold me a post box that they said, well, you've now got to go and secure it into the thing. So I was going to sort of write bolts and cable ties and all those sorts of things. Of course, the next thing, you put your name on it, but then, of course, you need a number. So you then got to go and apply for a number through the CTT office. And then, of course, you've already registered your residency with an address, but you've now not got the number added onto it. And so just getting those simple things. So there's a lot of running around. There's probably the correct sequence to do things. And yes, there are people out here who will be very helpful and you pay them a fee and they will sort out all these things for you, or you can go into it yourself and try and figure out how the system works, which through trial and error
could be hit and miss.
Could be a bit hit and miss, and
because you're right, you go to one place and say, oh no, you got to go over there, and you come back, and then eventually you get it right. But it's funny, like little things are quite, I think, fascinating for people. It's like garbage collection, especially us living in the country like I am and you do as well. We have to take our garbage down to the central garbage area where there are 3 or 4 major little dirt bins, dustbins, and then they get picked up every single day, which is great. So,
and the other thing, I mean, we have a bit of land, and we've just talking before we started recording this. There's getting into the beginning of the fire season now, so there's an obligation to do land clearance if you have a property that's got.
I think it's the latest 30th of May. You have
something
to
like the end of May, isn't it? And the camera will come round and they will check that you have trimmed all your land and that it's not a fire risk. But of course, you've then. I had to learn that being from Britain, we have a sort of history of doing bonfires during the winter, and if you have a garden, you just have a bonfire, and there's you don't have to ask anybody. Here, you have to phone up the bomberos. I think it's now all electronically, but you used to phone the bomberos, the fire department, request a fire number, tell them where you are, what you're burning, when you're burning it, and it would be registered. and very sensibly,
because they know exactly what's going on. They see a
exactly
plume of smoke.
Yeah, or somebody's on the hill opposite you, and they see a plume of smoke, and they think, "Oh, is that a wildfire?" And they send out the helicopter.
Because it's a sensitive thing in summer. I mean, we up here in the hills around here, suddenly you see a plume of smoke, and the next thing you got helicopters all coming over, and like everyone's on high alert.
Yeah. So learning those sorts of things, and some of those rules and processes, I mean, incredibly sensible. But you've got to learn them by trial and error. There's nobody really who will. I mean, unless good people. Right. And we're very lucky. We've got some great local residents who are Portuguese, and they've been incredibly helpful in talking us through the process of what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. So that's been a big learning curve.
Here at Algarve, Alex, obviously, we help people relocate. And this is a part where we've really struggled to try and find people to do commercially to help them once they've arrived. And we are getting places, so we are going to be releasing a new service soon, which is great. But it's a difficult one to
it is. I mean, there's if somebody could produce literally a one-pager, which is a literally step-by-step process of, once you.
I think it would be 100 pages.
Well, I probably would be. There's a lot of paperwork here.
Yeah. But what it's like living here. I mean, it's like, okay, things are a bit slower than London. But then again, you've got the flip side where everybody goes out for lunch, and it's very social.
I love that side of it. I remember when a couple of things stand in my mind when I got here, which was my neighbour, lovely gentleman called Nico. He says, "Charlie," he said, "you've got to be more Portuguese in your approach." I came out being very British about everything, trying to be efficient and do everything the correct way. And his view was almost just be more Portuguese, just let it flow, relax, don't get too highly strung about the process, because there is a degree of, you put your head above the radar, and you can almost create more problems for yourself than you might not otherwise.
And I see that with a lot of my English friends as well, who are very they get really upset when things don't work according to plan.
Whether it be, you've obviously got to, there's a lot of property is a very interesting one, in the sense of, we bought an old ruin that didn't have all the correct paperwork when we were buying it, because it had been in a Portuguese family for 3 generations, and there was a bit of a leap of faith. I had a good architect and a good lawyer who advised me on precedent, because you've obviously our land as well was split between urban and agricultural, so I had to understand what you could do in terms of expanding a house and what was necessary to get all the correct licenses, because the footprint of the house, which we were buying of XYZ square meters, was actually different from the actual size of the house. Yeah. And I said, well,
people add on over the time.
A third of it is kind of not registered. Yeah. Is this a problem? And we look back as much as we can. We actually, fortunately, the extensions and everything were done pre the 1950s. So this extra 50 or 55 square meters was, built before the strict
1951
laws came in, and that was, I think, when the first census was done on property sizes and everything else. But again, boundaries were a little bit ambiguous. There were, is this bit ours? Is that bit? Where's it?
But up until very recently, I remember Lolea Kamara turned around and said, "Guys, you have to put a white stake in, or like a white brick." And on the 4 corners of your property. That was a few years ago with your initials on it, because everyone's getting a bit confused about
it. And you've got one white stake at one end and one at the other end, and a wall that wiggles in between. You're thinking, well, is it the straight line, or do you follow the wall? So, and of course in the UK or a lot of other countries, people will argue and go to court over 6 inches of land, whereas here I think it's a little bit more general.
And there's another interesting thing about land as well. If it's not fenced off, people can just walk through it.
Correct, yeah.
And there are no signs and things. Yeah. So like often during Alfarroba season, was it carobs?
Carobs.
So a lot of the people come in to try and harvest the carobs, and they just walk straight into your land and just harvest them.
Which is, I have to say, I'm a land user, in the sense of one of the great joys of being here is the fact that you can pretty much walk anywhere you want to. I mean, I'm conscious of not walking through somebody's garden, but there are copious amounts of olive orchards and fields, and and I will walk the dogs or we'll go for a ramble or a bimble up, some mountainside, and quite frankly, I don't know whether I'm walking through private property. And I'm very conscious of people say things or being mindful of that. But it's nice to have so much of the country open.
And it does feel much more community oriented than "this is my land, get off it" kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're going to get people like that. But I remember one of our neighbors who right here up in the hills, he was really upset because there was this mountain bike downhill track where it ran through his land. And every year they would come and drive through his land and he would get very upset. He said, but they've been doing it for 15 years. You just got to relax a bit. You're not using the land.
It's like I mean, where we are, and I'm sure you have it around here as well, we still have the shepherds come through every day. And they will go where the sheep take them. Now, obviously, I actually feel a bit sorry for them because as even in the last 6 years or so, I've seen more and more of the properties that were open all being fenced off, and there's less and less freedom for those sorts of activities or those sorts of vocations to go through the land and graze the land as they used to. And if that way of life stops or changes, that would actually be a great shame, because I think that's part of the beauty of being out here. There's still that sort of rural element to it. I mean, we have
stopping for a herd of sheep is just wonderful.
Yeah, and we have the farmer who comes down. I mean, never seems to be off his tractor. He doesn't walk anywhere, and he potters along, and we leave a bag out on our fence, and the next minute the following day it's full of his own local honey, and we know that those hives are from beehives that are a couple of kilometres away, and the goats and the sheep come grazing through, and it's just it's a lovely. It's got a lovely flow to life when you're in land. Not quite the same on the coast, which is a very, very different form of life. And that was the beauty when you actually move here. And we made a conscious decision that we weren't going to live within the preconceived communities or the resort type communities. We wanted, if we were going to live in Portugal, we wanted to live in Portugal, try and speak Portuguese, and my view is still very much a guest in this country. So you accept and you embrace their way of life, and
you don't try and change them to your way of life.
No,
which is wonderful.
I think that's from my point of view anyway, and I'm very lucky that I've spent a lot of my life traveling the world. You go in to learn about people's way of life and cultures, and if you decide to put roots down somewhere, you accept that is the way it is, and you don't come in with an attitude of saying, things have got to be, it's much better in my country and you've got to do it this way, and this. And actually, I think that's respectful of them, and it does slightly annoy me when people come in, and even the other day I was in a petrol station, and a gentleman came in and just immediately goes into speaks English to the lady behind the counter, assuming that she's going to be an English speaker. And she sort of looked at him. Now, I knew her, so I know she actually does understand English, but it was just the fifth out. There was no effort.
Yeah, and you say, excuse me, do you speak like fala Portuguese or fala English or whatever?
Desculpa, meu Português não é muito bom. And even if it's bom dia, como está tudo, or there is so much basic language that if you're holidaying or living here, it's not that difficult to learn.
Exactly, it's 2 words, like bon dia.
Yeah,
like
bon
I'm
dia.
walking along the street, in the countryside here, and you say good morning to someone. I can see that they're foreigners. I'll always say good morning in Portuguese because we're in Portugal.
Absolutely.
And it's not difficult to learn.
Well, as the lady in the garage then explained to me after the gentleman left, she said, well, if he'd walked into, if I as a Portuguese lady had walked into an English gas station and started speaking Portuguese, what does she expect the reply is going to be?
Exactly.
So I think, living here, you have certain, you should have certain obligations to blend in and to understand the mentality, because it's a very different mentality as well. And so yes, aside the fact that I was told to be more Portuguese and more laid back, I also learned that there's a Portuguese that people will see from a tourist perspective, and then there's a Portuguese that you'll see from a residents or people who live here perspective. And Portuguese are generally a very incredibly friendly, hospitable nation and peoples. But there's also, like everywhere, there's an underbelly to things, and you have to understand the mindset. And you're talking about things like mechanics, and that there's that.
Oh, I can feel a long story coming up because I know all about your mechanics.
I could go on. We haven't got all day, but you just have to learn how to think as they do. And I have had a lot of friends who've said, you take a mechanic as an example. You can go there and something that you book a time and an appointment, and your work gets done within 2 or 3 days, and you get a bill, and it's done. Here, I mean, I've had motorcycles, cars, and I might not have seen them for a couple of months, and there's very little feedback as to why or what. It could be parts need to be ordered, or so many times I've been in a garage, for example, and people just turn up, and then they'll go off one job and start looking at another, and there's a lot of it's kind of like, oh yeah, I'll bring that in too, and then you're thinking, but my car needs to be worked on.
Yeah, and it was first in line
tomorrow, and you're just sort of no fashmal, and that can be frustrating.
But it's often the person who shouts loudest gets service first.
That I've also learned. I think I was very placid in approach to things, and then you actually realise that you do need to have a fairly robust way about you, and actually not be afraid to say no, or put your foot down sometimes, because there is then a response, and they then know that you're serious. And I think that I don't think you go in with that arrogant view of Portugal's a little country, and I mean, you look at Portugal and its history. I mean, it was the big boy of Europe before most of the big boys of Europe.
Fantastic history,
amazing history. So there is a culture here that is to be respected,
and precedes all other nations. They're one of the oldest nations in the world.
Totally.
So there's a lot of respect there.
But you've got to understand how to trigger the best response, and actually, firmness. And when I think I take the view, it's a bit like sort of the baseball analogy. It's sort of 3 strikes and I'll then react. First 2, I'll be polite, and you can do things diplomatically. And then if you realise that it's actually not creating the reaction you want to, then you can put your foot down, and then they do actually respond. And I think that's probably the case in most countries.
Absolutely. Yeah. How about community? I mean, here in Lolé itself, we're in Sabraj right now, but Lolé, Sabraj, how do you find community? You're a very gregarious person, Charlie. Was it super easy to make friends and develop some good friendships here?
Yes, it was. But if I'm being very transparent about the process, which I think you probably want me to.
Yeah, exactly. This is not the tourism book.
I found that when I think anybody who arrives down here, and I mean we were fairly fortunate in the sense I knew a base of people anyway, but I think you're assessed.
Met with skepticism.
People I think, oh, who are they? What's their story? And if I'm being slightly cynical about it, are they useful? In whatever context, it could be, are they going to fit into the social scene here? Are they, there is such a diverse range of people who live down in the Algarve. You never quite know who you're sitting next to, what their story is. So you do actually have to be quite careful in the context of, being too blasé about things. And everybody will have their own story for moving down. But yeah, we spent a lot of time, meeting people and being invited to places, and it's a small community where you can meet people very quickly. But we became, I don't want this to sound sort of too highfalutin, but we just evolved a group of friends who were probably more in keeping with our own, genre and rhythm of life, and met people like yourselves through mutual interests of nature and the outdoors and being adventurous and active. And I think that's the way in life. I mean, there's a general opinion that if you want to meet like-minded people, if you, do the activities you enjoy meeting, and then those people who also enjoy those will find you and you'll be surrounded by them. So yes, there's always that. There's that.
The mechanics of finding people is pretty easy, right? I mean, you just get onto the...
Well, one of my sort of, and you know him as well, old Dean Coleman.
Yeah.
Dean I went to because I needed some new business cards printed, and somebody recommended his.
Because he's got a print
up.
shop.
Yeah,
he's got a place where he prints business cards and things. And he's kind of like the center of expat.
Well, he was. And then the next thing I know, I mean, Dean's South African, so we had a common interest in terms of my wife and his country of birth. But Dean was incredibly helpful. He said, "Oh, you must meet so-and-so. You're going to like them. You must meet them, and you must meet them." And I think your name came up in that conversation.
Yeah, that's how we met.
Dean, that's how we met. Yeah. And that would create a ripple effect. And then through you, I've met other people, and then those people. And then also, partly because of how I found Portugal's role in my business, which was, I came down here to live and to use as a base, but I never actually thought it would be a place of work. My work was always going to be in the Far East or the wild boonies of somewhere else. But when COVID kicked in and we were renovating the house, but there were various windows that open up, and I'm a big enduro dirt bike rider. And during the weekends, I'd be sort of in the garden clearing stuff out, and I'd hear this, at the back of the house, and there were dirt bikes everywhere, and I was thinking, this is a big culture here. And I started asking around, and eventually I found, the people to speak to in terms of how to do, where and how to do dirt riding around here. And this country as a recreational playground, you're a water babe, I'm a dirt babe, but there is an awful lot to do in terms of walking, dirt riding, e-foiling, paddle boarding, kite boarding, rock climbing down in the sort of cliffs down near Sagres, all those sorts of activities, paragliding.
I mean, you recently did like a 4 or 5 day trip up to Alentejo, I think. On
I did, I'm exploring this. I'll call it the Iberian Peninsula, for want of a better word, but obviously starts with Portugal, because there is so much to go and see if you don't treat Portugal like it's just beaches and golf courses. And beaches and golf courses are great for holidays, great for short periods of time. But if you live here, you need to actually go and explore the interior. And there's a massive amount of Neolithic history. There's a massive amount of Roman history further up north. You've obviously got all the Portuguese history sort of from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And the Templar history and the Order of Cristo and the Great Age of Discovery history. But you've got to go and dig it out because it's fairly low key in comparison to Spain or Italy or France even, because it was much older and therefore it's had more time to disappear or disintegrate, or it wasn't built in as grand, form. But
there's some great books to investigate. I mean, I've been reading quite a few books about the Portuguese history and right around where we are. I mean, there's like all these 62 border castles around here that I've been, looked at, and there's just so much to explore. And you've obviously explored a lot of the Algarve itself. I mean, I think you walked across the Algarve completely, didn't you?
I did. I was. It was COVID. I was getting a bit stir crazy, and I worked with a British wildlife conservation charity called Tusk, and I couldn't participate in their annual fundraiser. And I was sitting at home, and I wanted to learn. I wanted to see this country, and I remember sort of sitting down and thinking, well, how am I best going to do it? And I just read about the Via Algarviana, which had been opened up a few years before, which is a trans cross-country route that runs from Alcutim to Cabo de São Vicente, down on the Cape St. Vincent, down on the very far western tip of Portugal. It's 301 kilometres. And I thought, why don't I just go and walk it?
But not just walk it. You did it back to back. You just didn't stop.
Well, I wasn't. I didn't constantly, but it took me 6 days. I remember being dropped off at Alcutim by my wife about 9 o'clock in the morning on day one, and off I set. And it was November, early November, and I think from memory there had been some big rains about a week before, and I didn't really know how those. I mean, part of my job is understanding weather systems and how they affect, canyons and wadis in the desert, and as you well know, rising and flows of rivers. But I didn't really understand the topography here. So I get to Alcutim and I start off walking. It's a lovely, beautiful
Autumn
18
day.
degrees,
Yeah.
autumn day.
Yeah.
And off I go. And I was brilliant up until about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And I suddenly come across the first raging river crossing. And this isn't just to sort of take your socks and shoes off and, up to your knees in a river crossing. It was, I think it is during the summer. In fact, it probably dry during the summer. This was chest high, raging down out of the mountains out to the coastline. And it was my only point of crossing. Anyway, long story short, I kind of got myself across this river, much to sort of, to my relief. And then I kept on walking. And I kept walking, and the night came, and I was fully equipped with head torches and a bivvy bag and everything else. But yeah, I slept in bus shelters for a couple of hours, and little towns on benches. And then every morning, my wife would drive to wherever I was, and she'd resupply me with a bit of food, fresh pair of socks, and make sure I was all right. I think I walked about 65 Ks in the first 22 hours.
Crazy.
And I looked like a zombie.
Ah.
I walked across the whole country, and I saw a huge amount of it. It's sort of much of it was a couple of observations came out of it. Pretty much from east to west, it's very empty, and this path runs, let's say, approximately 15 kilometers inland. I mean, you've walked parts of it with me. Yep. So we were up in Branco de Vella.
Oh.
I think maybe 15 Ks from the coast.
Yep.
So it pretty much follows a sort of 15 K parallel inland from the coast. And the terrain's very similar, up and down, up and down, up and down, goes through lots of river valleys, and you lose the height, gain the height. My main observation was very devoid of wildlife, which was a great shame. I didn't see very much at all bird life. Saw a fine wild boar.
You saw a wild boar.
A big old wild boar near Silves. Yeah. I think I saw an otter.
Yeah, but there's otters.
I think I saw an otter, but up around Montchique, which was rather beautiful. I literally looked back. Something sort of made me turn around in this sort of...
No rabbits, no foxes.
A few rabbits, no foxes, very little. Striking star constellations and like shooting stars. I remember walking at night, and I was coming up towards Cachopo, I think it is.
That's north of Tavera, yeah.
That's right. And it was a beautiful clear night, and the shooting stars and the stargazing were absolutely phenomenal. Fantastic. Lot of dogs roaming around at night, and you have to carry the old big stick. But it's
stray dogs are a thing.
It was wonderful to see that diversity of the country. I'm thoroughly pleased I walked it. And but that terrain is I mean, there's nobody there.
That's what's beautiful about it as well. It's amazing how remote it is. So now for Drift Adventure, your company, what's the next trip that you're going on? I mean, are you...
One that you joined me on last year, actually. I'm going up to the Picos de Europa.
Yeah, we actually have a video about that. A couple of videos.
So I'm going up there in a couple of weeks' time. And pretty much the same trip that you and I did, with an additional little day onto that one. So that'll be rather nice, because right now it's getting quite hot and toasty down here. So always nice to go from the mid-30s up to the mid-20s. Up in the Picos de Europa, which is, for those who don't know, it's this gorgeous little isolated mountain range in the north of Spain, separated from the Pyrenees, in the canton or district of Asturias. It's only sort of 25 kilometers by 15 in circumference. Very like the Dolomites.
Beautiful looking.
Yeah, it's really, and very historical. Because the area that we're actually going to, which we didn't quite manage to get to, is Covadonga. And as you well know, because we both like our history, that was where the Reconquista started. So
I love the way they call it the Reconquest.
Reconquest.
It's
yes.
like,
I mean,
but you weren't there before.
Who was there first?
Exactly.
Exactly.
So exactly where all the Christians started.
Precisely.
The whole Portugal's essentially started there.
It did, and then it pushed out, and it drove the incumbent Moorish, again, probably unfair to even call them occupiers, because,
they've been there for 5 centuries.
Who's to say who was here first? Anyway, they expanded out from that area, and then, through the course of the next probably 50 years, I think. They pushed and pushed and pushed. And then I think the last Moorish stronghold was in the caves in the...
Albufeira.
Yeah, in that area. And up on the... what's that flat top mountain at north of
Salir.
Salir?
Salir, yeah. It's called Rocha de Pena.
Rocha de Pena, that's right.
And then, so Rocha de Pena, Salir, and then down to Paderno was another stronghold.
Correct.
And then they were ejected right down at the
So that started up in Covadonga. So we're going up there, and a bit of history up there. And beautiful area. And then I'm going to go and do try and find not a unique route, because I don't reinvent the wheel. I just do it the way that feels right to me. So I'm not trying to claim I'm a great trailblazer, but I'm going to try and do a sort of combined Peneda Gerês National Park stroke Camino de Santiago. So through Portugal, following the old Roman roads that come up from Braga. There's this amazing section of Roman roads with these mile markers that actually have the incumbent, or at the time Caesar of Rome written on them, and they run from Braga up through into Peneda Gerês National Park, which again you've got the Iberian lynx has just been released up there and is thriving. You've actually got wolves up there, packs of wolves that roam that area. So it's a rewilded area, and then that goes up into the borders of Galicia and then continues up to Santiago. So I think there's some lovely areas to discover around there.
That's fantastic. I mean, if anybody wants to get on one of your trips, how do they contact you?
Through my website, which is driftadventure.co.uk, or Instagram, driftadventure. You can always make contact through that. So yes, I run a few things through here, but again, Iberia is actually a really big area. You've got that lovely Templar history as well, which I think is fascinating. And although it's not specifically sort of adventure trips, there's some amazing history in Tomar, which I think you've been to as well.
Yes,
I looked around that.
Lovely place. Yeah, amazing.
And then they actually had a big link with Castro Marine, which is down on the River Guadiana. My understanding is when the Templars were tried for heresy, and they all fled across to Portugal.
On Friday the 13th.
Correct, on Friday the 13th, which is where that ominous date comes from. They were granted sanctuary in Portugal because I think King Alfonso was a temple Grand Master. But he said, guys, the heat's on you a bit at the moment, so best go down to Castro Marine, keep your head down. They came down here, kept their head down for a little bit, and then the Templar Order was renamed the Order of Cristo. And then they set up a base in Tomar, which was, again, replicating the Templar Order, and the church that is below Tomar, I think, is a replication of the Church of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. There's Grail history there. There's all sorts of...
Oh, yeah, I remember you told us the story about opening this...
Allegedly, well, I mean, there's a pillar in the church, and I went and spoke to the warden of the church. I said, do I understand there's a chiseling out of a cup of Christ, a Grail symbol? And she looked at me. She said, not many people seem to know about that because it's out in the bag now.
You just let it out the bag.
I just let it out of the bag. But yeah, there is this amazing, I mean, it looks like the cup of Christ out of Indiana Jones films, but it's chiseled into the floor.
But it's not actually a cup of Christ. It's just a hole where it was.
My understanding is that they used to mark the resting places of the Holy Grail by this symbol. So it was deemed to be, this was a marker that said at some point in time the Grail was here. Now the Grail legend is, we could have a whole different podcast on that, and I'm not the expert on it, but I find it fascinating. But whatever the Grail was, if it even existed, allegedly the Templar treasure, when these few Templars were escaping the Friday the 13th edict to round them all up, they brought the Templar treasure with them, which had been accrued through the Crusades in Jerusalem, into Portugal, of which the Grail was apparently one of those things. But the most important thing, or one of the significant things for Portugal, was that they brought a navigational device, a sextant type of device, which I think still features in the flag of Portugal.
It does, that ring, that sort of round-looking
And that
orb.
was given to the king of the time, which then triggered the Age of Discovery. and Henry.
And apparently they financed a lot of the discoveries as well, the Templars as well.
I believe so.
Yeah.
So that's where Portugal, and this was 200 years before Spain or Britain or Holland became their colonial powers in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. This was, you're talking the 1350s, 1400s, and then, Magellan and Henry the Navigator and
Bartholomew Diaz.
even set sail, Quelver, just up the road a little bit. So that huge history. So I find that stuff interesting, which I would never have known about had I not moved down here.
And I agree with you. I mean, I think initially when you move down here, a lot of people have that, oh, my country's better than this. These guys don't know what they're doing. But when you understand the history, it gives you so much respect for the country. Yeah. It really does. So I think it's important for us all to
embrace it. Yeah, I mean, you've got Lisbon and Porto, which take the headlines, and you've got the Algarve, that is very much known as the tourist destination. But you've got some amazing places like Elvas and Marvão and Bragança and.
I'm actually writing an article on Elvas right now. I need to go and finish it.
Elvas I only really discovered a few months ago, and that was through riding through the country. And then I came across this amazing town on the border with Spain, with a castle that would put any castle in Britain to shame.
It's one of the 3 most impressive fortifications in the whole country.
It's
incredible.
Really extraordinary. But nobody knows about it.
I know.
It's never shouted from the rafters.
But we've got to kind of cut it off there. But it's fantastic, Charlie. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it, man. It's nice to see you.
AlgarveAddicts.com